Rhee here with Sam Tanenhaus at the New York Times, and Sam is the book review editor here. We have a great show lined up for you, so stay tuned. We'll be right back.
I'm nuts about downtown Baltimore's West Side. Hello, I'm John Waters, and I'm proud to say that Baltimore has always been my home. It's the inspiration behind all my films, including Hairspray, Crybaby, Serial Mom, and A Dirty Shame. Let me tell you, there are not a more eccentric, monumental, eclectic, intriguing, and character-filled 28 blocks anywhere in the world, and I'm here to prove it to you. This is where Babe Ruth was born. They tell me he's the best baseball player ever. Not that I'd know. I'm more into theater. Like nearby Arena Players, the nation's longest continuously running African-American community theater. I'm also a big fan of century-old Antique Row, where New York dealers come to buy and later mark up their purchases sky high for their Manhattan buyers. On that same block sits the U.B. Blake National Jazz Institute, housing memorabilia from Baltimore jazz greats like Billie Holiday and, of course, U.B. himself. The West Side is also where the Maryland Historical Society calls home, with its many Baltimore artifacts, including the original manuscript of the Star-Spangled Banner and Nipper, the RCA dog. Know of a place where the Beatles, Al Roker, Mother Teresa, and P.T. Barnum all hung out? I'll tell you, the West Side of downtown Baltimore. Al Roker? He's done live shows at the world-famous Lexington Market, where you can shuck oysters and see some of the most amazing hairdos in town.
Welcome back. We're here with Sam Tanenhaus, book review editor of the New York Times. So Sam, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Gee, well, I am a journalist and author and now editor. Before I came to the book review to edit it, I had been a writer for Vanity Fair magazine. They call it contributing editor, which really means a contract writer. I did that for about 5 years. And I had always been interested in the book review. I'd written for it over time. I'd done a fair amount of book reviewing. I'd written books myself. And this is a job that seemed interesting.
Tell us, what does a book review editor do?
Well, at the Times, this is a pretty big operation compared to most book reviews connected to newspapers, because we review so many books.
How many books?
Well, we do about 1,500 a year, which is only a small fraction of the number published. Right. So that means our main job is really deciding which books to review. And there are 8 or 9 editors here, in addition to myself, who look at advanced reading copies, galleys, when they come in, months before the publication dates, and decide which books we think we should review and who should review them. Then the editors, who all have areas of expertise or particular interests, will contact reviewers, see if they're interested in reviewing the book. If they are, they'll give them a deadline of a few weeks to review it, to read the book, write the review, and then when we schedule an issue in which we're including that review, because the publication date of the book is upon us, the editor then works with the reviewer, editing the review closely and getting it ready for publication.
So Sam, how long have you been at the Times, and what changes have you noticed since you've been here?
Well, I've been here twice. I was first here in the late 90s for about 1.5 years as an editor on the op-ed page, and then came back here in the spring of 2004, not quite 4 years ago. The most important change in the newspaper itself is our online presence. We're now very much a web publication as well as a print publication. And so that affects a lot of what we do in the way we cover books, in the way we respond to the literary scene and the readers we try to reach. But that's the single biggest difference. We do a podcast now. When I came here in 2004, I couldn't have told you what a podcast was. I'm not sure they existed. We have an online reading group we do once a month where we have prominent writers discuss a classic. We're now doing Walker Percy's The Moviegoer. And we have various related features we do that are really kind of web-driven.
Yeah, actually, I was listening to one of your podcasts last night.
Oh, you were?
Yeah.
Well, that must have been a boring night for you.
No, it was very exciting, actually.
Well, we really enjoy doing it, and that's a sign of how things have changed or evolved here. When we first began doing that, which I think was about 1.5 years ago, it was mainly a conversation among the staff. And then as we saw authors were available for interviews, we now have them come in and we'll interview them about their books or talk to reviewers. And that's something we do every week, and we put a lot into it. We all really enjoy doing it.
Now, speaking of the online presence, do you do anything with like the book channel, or I know there's another one out there, the author channel?
We don't, not in an official way. We don't have any connection with them. Sometimes they'll ask me or another editor to appear on the program for one reason or another. Sometimes if I give a talk or a lecture, C-SPAN, either the regular C-SPAN or the book channel will pick that up. But we don't have a relationship with them of any kind. Also, they once did a program where they sort of looked at the book review when we were in our older building. That's the other big change, is we're now in this fancy new 21st century high-rise. And they just had a cameraman to follow me around for an hour or so and talk to editors. So people who watch those programs know about us, but again, there's no official or even, informal relationship we have with them.
Do you think you have the type of power where a bad review could either make or break a new book?
I don't know. I think there was probably a time when that was more the case. I think those things tend to be exaggerated. If one is an author unhappy about an unfavorable review that appeared here and the book doesn't do well, it's probably a natural impulse to say, well, because I got this lousy review, my book didn't sell. But books are covered in so many ways now, on television, online, through all the blogs, and also, particularly nonfiction, books are often the subject of news stories or columns. Our own op-ed columnists will write about them. They'll bring a lot of attention to a book. And finally, you have to remember that in addition to the book review, the Times has an entirely separate group of daily book critics who are not connected to us in any way. They don't work with us. I don't edit them. They select their own books for review. They have an editor, Rick Lyman, who's at the daily paper. And so those reviews are also important. And the Times is unique, I think, now in having two sets of reviews often of books, especially by major authors, one that appears in the daily paper and one on Sunday.
So a book could be reviewed twice then, by the daily book critics and then by your department.
Yes, that's right. And that's confusing to a lot of people and sometimes to us, but it actually originates in the early history of newspapers when the Sunday paper was very separate from the daily. Before the Times really became a national publication, printed all over the country and available every day in the print edition, and of course, particularly online, there were many subscribers who read it only on Sunday. So they would read the book review to see book coverage, whereas people more locally would see the daily paper as well, and they would end up seeing, in effect, the two reviews. And sometimes the daily critics will go out of their way to review different books from us because they sometimes have special interests as well. For instance, Janet Maslin likes to write a lot about mysteries. Now, we have a mystery columnist, Marilyn Stasio, who does a column for us every other week, but she's not reviewing all the mystery books as they come out, so there's lots of room for Janet to review separately books that we may not review at all.
Now, what do you do when there is overlap between your two departments and you're like, hated it, and then the daily critics are like, loved it, and then what do you do?
Well, actually, their reviews tend to run first, so it's the reader who will have that reaction, not us so much. Well, it just goes to show you, I think, in a very good, positive way, that book reviews are opinion journalism. And someone can write a book that one critic admires and another one dislikes, and which is the way most readers react to books in their own individual way. And I think that's actually good. Now, where I think it's most disappointing for authors is when their book is not reviewed at all. And they wonder, well, why did someone else's book get reviewed twice when mine wasn't at all?
Right. And what do you say to those authors?
Well, what we say is, first of all, because we're working on separate tracks, we don't know what the daily critics will be reviewing. And second, often, especially with really prominent authors, readers are interested in hearing more than one opinion. And finally, the critics themselves, the daily critics, need to be able to write about the books that interest them, or the authors whose careers they've been following closely. You know, with John Updike or Philip Roth, who has a major book come out every year or two. It's pretty hard for a daily critic not to review those major authors, and yet we know our readers want to know about those books too. So it's really it's an odd sort of logic, but it does make sense in the end, I think.
Now, you recently put yourself out there with your own book, right?
Well, it was a while ago. Okay. I wrote a biography of sometime Baltimore, not native, but resident of Whittaker Chambers, and that dealt with the Alger Hiss spy perjury case, and Hiss actually was a Baltimore native. So that was a book I spent many years writing before I'd come to the Times. And that was a good experience because it was reviewed in many places, not always favorably. Right. So I know how authors feel when they're waiting for the review to come in.
Right. And you spent some time in Baltimore as well researching the book. Is that right?
I did, yes. I wanted to visit all the locations where Chambers had lived. Chambers had been an underground communist, so he changed addresses often. And one of the central dramas in his life, in what was the great spy case of the 20th century, the Hiss case, had to do with his relationship with Alger Hiss. Chambers said Hiss had been a confederate of his in the communist underground, and Hiss, who came from quite an old Baltimore family, denied it. So part of my job as a biographer, as Chambers' biographer, was to establish how well they might have known each other in Baltimore. So I looked at the addresses where they lived and their haunts, and so I got to know the city a little bit. Not very well, but a little bit.
So did you come to your own conclusions while you were writing that book about what was going on?
Yes, the documentary evidence is very strong that Hiss had indeed been involved in underground communism, as Chambers had alleged. There was a great deal of evidence at the time of the case, which was in the late 40s, but more evidence became available after the fall of the Soviet Union, when communist archives were opened up in Moscow and the United States, and I drew on a lot of that evidence as well in the mid-90s.
So any plans for another book?
Well, I'm now writing a biography of William F. Buckley, Jr.
Okay.
Although now that I'm doing two jobs here at the paper, I just began in January editing the Week in Review in addition to the book review, another big Sunday section. My hours are pretty full. Right. But that's a book I've been working on for a number of years now.
Yeah, those are all the William F. Buckley books we see behind us, right?
Those are some of them. There are lots more.
And plus the internet.
Yes, and luckily a lot of Buckley material is available on the internet, but some of it isn't. You know, sooner or later when you do this kind of biographical research, you have to go to old-fashioned archives and libraries and all those other institutions we're kind of forgetting about, but are still really important for us to maintain.
Well, speaking of Baltimore, what are your thoughts on H.L. Menken?
Well, Menken was, of course, one of America's greatest journalists and critics, and I had the fortunate experience when I was in Baltimore researching Chambers' life. I was taken around by someone who worked in the Pratt Library, I think it is, where the Menken room is. So he gave me a close tour of all the Menken books there. And I'm an admirer of Menken. Who isn't? He was one of the great authentic American voices, and wrote about everything: language, politics, culture, music, literature, you name it, he wrote about it, and really helped invent, I think, sophisticated modern journalism. To some extent, all of us who are journalists now owe a lot to H.L. Menken, and the language holds up. I read him a lot. There's a little collection of his, edited by Alistair Cook, who was a huge admirer of his, you know, the great British journalist, called H.L. Menken on Politics, that I find myself rereading all the time. His little portraits of Franklin Roosevelt and William Jennings Bryan and figures like that. Remarkable figure.
Sam, that was wonderful. And we'll be right back with more with Sam Tanenhaus, so don't touch that dial. Nope.
And right in the middle of it all, as if just to add mystery and intrigue, sits the gravesite of Edgar Allan Poe, my kind of guy. Sometimes I go there to meditate. Now, the thing that defines Baltimore for many people around the world is right here also. Our sports franchises, the Orioles and the Ravens, two birds that nest in the West. The Walters Art Museum is also known internationally, featuring an interactive experience exploring 55 centuries of art. And as for P.T. Barnum, he, along with the likes of Cab Calloway, Chick Webb, Milton Berle, and a young, debuting Frank Sinatra, all performed at the world-famous Hippodrome Theater, one of the true cornerstones of the West Side. I saw Cleopatra there, and even shot parts of Cecil B. Demented outside before they fixed it up. The real story today, however, is how all that energy is coming back to the West Side. Bigger, smarter, more fragrant, and more exciting than ever before. Major traveling Broadway shows like Phantom of the Opera and Disney's The Lion King, infectious, fashionable, full of vim and Baltimore vigor, I walk the West Side streets these days in amazement at what it's become. I'm nuts about downtown Baltimore's West Side. You will be, too.
Welcome back. We're here with Sam Tanenhaus, book review editor of the New York Times. What advice do you have for authors out there that are struggling?
Well, if they're struggling to become really accomplished writers, then there are two things you do. You write a lot and you read a lot. And sometimes it seems to me, I could be mistaken, it's an impression I have, is that aspiring authors don't read as widely and deeply and above all as closely as they used to. I mean, when you read a major writer, someone whose work appeals to you and someone who writes in a voice or tone that you think you might like to approximate in some way, you have to read that author really closely. I mean, down to the level of the comma. It's not good enough to read a novel you like and have been, if you're a fiction writer, and be moved by the story and characters and think I'd like to do that. You have to try to figure out how they did it.
So you mean really study it?
Study it very closely. Writing, I think 3/4 of it or more is technique. There's some degree of talent and then also discipline and stamina. You have to stay with it. But a lot of it is mastering techniques. And they are there in the best writing to be learned, but you have to kind of teach yourself how to do it.
And what do you say to all the authors out there who are self-published, who don't have a book in a bookstore where they can be reviewed by the New York Times?
Well, you know, that is something that may one day change. For now, you're absolutely right. We don't review self-published books. For the reason you've suggested, if a book is not available in a bookstore, we don't review it. We are, to some extent, a news organization. We're part of a newspaper, so we're informing readers about books that are available for them. And we think of our readership still as people who go to bookstores, or they may go to Amazon or some other, BarnesandNoble.com, some other big line provider, but we still think of ourselves as being connected to the reading public that goes to bookstores. So we don't review those books. On the other hand, authors of self-published books often use that as a stepping stone to interest publishers in their work. So there's no reason to be discouraged if you are not finding a publisher.
Okay, so when you and your staff are reviewing a book, what do you look for? Like, what little gem are you looking for?
Well, that's a good question because it depends. There is no set formula. If it is a nonfiction book, it has to be on a topic we think will be of interest to general readers. We have a very broad and diverse readership, but we assume our readers, while knowledgeable and intelligent, are not specialists. So a very narrowly focused book that's very technical or that's written for a specialized audience, we're less inclined to review. If it is a book on politics or history, then we look to see how many other books are coming out in the same topic. So we look for something new, either new reporting or new information. And above all, we look for quality. Does someone seem to be a strong original writer who has organized his or her material in an interesting way that will will hold the interest of our previewers. They look at something like 1,000 books a year, so they are not that easy to impress. And when it comes to fiction, the bar is even higher, because fiction is harder to write than nonfiction. A book can be not especially well written. It can be on a topic we know about, say the war in Iraq, but if there's anything new or interesting in it, that is usually enough for the reviewer we send the book to find something to say about. Nonfiction's easier to review because a reviewer is often writing about the subject as much as about the book.
And you can check the facts, right?
And to the best we're able, and we try very hard, we check the facts. Fiction is more difficult because it's wholly invented, wholly original, and because you're creating something out of your imagination, the likelihood of it succeeding is smaller. There just aren't ever that many good works of fiction being published. And publishers also publish far fewer books of fiction. So we're looking at fewer books to begin with, and the bar is high for them, and especially for newer authors, because you have asked about the impact a negative review can have. Well, if an author is just starting out and with a first book or a collection of short stories, and when we look at it, we see very obvious defects or shortcomings, we know our reviewers are going to be even tougher, and we don't want to publish a very critical or negative review of an author who's just starting out in his or her career. It doesn't seem fair, really. It's one thing, if somebody's a public figure, they're fair game. Right. And their career is established. But you want to be careful with people who are starting out.
So go easy on the newbies, huh?
Well, we try to. Of course, we also like, whenever possible, to call attention to talented writers. So the cover review, we put one review on the cover each week that we call particular attention to. This for Sunday, February 3rd, Super Bowl Sunday, is of a first novel by a young writer named Charles Bach. He's not that young. He spent 11 years writing this book. But we do that maybe 2 or 3 times a year, find a first novel so strong, and that our critic, whoever it happens to be, is so impressed by that we think we can put it on the cover of the book review.
Now, you mentioned that people aren't writing as much fiction as they did before, and it hasn't been as good. Like, what other trends do you see in writing and books?
Well, the last few years since I've been in this job, there's been a huge number, far too many in my view, of polemical books on politics. Books
like since post 9/11?
Post 9/11, the 2004 election was very fraught because of the red state, blue state polarization, and the partisanship in politics and government, and also because politics has become so much of the cable TV and internet conversation. There are just many, many books, usually written from a partisan rather than analytical perspective on politics. And after a while, they kind of sound alike, and they don't seem to be as thoughtful and as challenging as they might be. But there are but political books are certainly a big trend. There are many books on religion and atheism these days. That's one of the big debates in the culture. So some of the big bestsellers in recent years have been books of attacking religion or questioning religion, and they followed a wave of books that espoused religion. So some of the debates in the culture that you see are being reflected more and more in books that are published.
So what type of genre do you like to read?
I like reading fiction. I like a lot of the sort of classic novelists. That's one reason we started our reading room feature. The first book.
What's the reading room?
Well, that's an online discussion group where we choose a literary classic. It can be very old or quite recent. The first book we chose was War and Peace because it was a new translation. And someone here at the book review, in that case it was me, and 2 or 3 other readers just discuss it. Okay. They're professional authors. It's not a book club, although we invite comments on the posts we put up. It's not when we invite thousands of readers just to talk among themselves. We try to create a dialogue among these accomplished writers, and we do that once a month. So we did War and Peace first. We alternate fiction and nonfiction. The second book we did was The Education of Henry Adams. And now we're doing Walker Percy's The Moviegoer, which was published in 1962, so kind of a modern classic.
Sam, what do you think of the current publishing and distribution market and new technologies and how it affects books?
Well, publishing is an industry that's needed a lot of new technology because in many ways it's really old-fashioned. We are going to publish an essay very soon by my colleague Rachel Donadio, who describes how it can take more than a year for a publisher actually to publish a book they've already bought and have scheduled. Books are still shipped by truck across the country. It's one reason we're very careful about publication dates and on sale dates, because we may review a book and it turns out not to be available in stores. So the new technologies are making more books available much more rapidly to many more readers. So the questions for the authors of those books will be how that rapid technology can translate into the kind of broader literary recognition they want to get. How will general readers know about them? How will readers of the New York Times Book Review, which doesn't review self-published books, learn about them? And there, my feeling is, and it's just intuition, I'm not an expert, is that a certain number of writers will come up through those processes. That's right. And attract the interest of editors. Editors at book publishing houses are always looking for talented new writers, and often talent gets overlooked. This is the story of literature for hundreds of years, is that writers of real promise can be overlooked because they're different and original in ways that editors aren't used to, or something just falls through the cracks. So this will make, the new technologies will make more books available to be read somehow. And for the select few authors, I think, that will eventually translate into more traditional publishing opportunities for them.
Now, speaking of new technologies, do you think the internet is shaping the way people read books and select books?
I think yes, I think in a few ways. For one, because there is so much review coverage, so many books are written about online, that's where many people go, especially younger people, I think, to find out about new books. So if a popular blogger likes a certain book or interviews an author, does a podcast, more readers will find out about it. And I think particularly, again, among the young, authors are building reputations online. There are authors with their own websites now. I think it's probably more common than uncommon for a newer author to have his or her own website. So authors can connect with readers more directly that way. And also the style of writing that happens online, blogging in particular, seems to be affecting the kind of prose one sees. It's written in a more casual way. The
conversation.
Yes, conversational. The author's voice may be more conspicuous than it was in the past. There's not as much of a kind of pretense or attempt at objectivity. So it's leading to a different kind of style of discourse, as they say, which seems to be finding its way into books.
Okay, thank you. And
thank you.
Sam, any last thoughts for our viewing audience out there?
Oh, just keep reading. There are great writers out there. There are important books, fiction and nonfiction, and we review as many of them as we can. Don't just judge by what we say, but other publications too, including the Baltimore Sun. So just read. It's unique experience, and there's no better way to learn about yourself and the world.
Okay, thank you very much, Sam.
Thank you. My pleasure.
This has been Lil Rhee with Top of the Morning, a special edition here with Sam Tanenhaus, book review editor at the New York Times. We'll see you next time.